The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom cast a golden glow over the evening, illuminating the culmination of my life's work. Tonight was the night my son was officially taking the reins of the Morton Corporation. Then my husband stepped up to the microphone and apologized to the crowd. The truth is, Richard's voice echoed through the hushed room, trembling with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. The boy Coral raised isn't ours. He is the posthumous son of my late brother. The real heir, our biological child, is the one who suffered severe brain damage from an untreated fever years ago. A collective gasp swept through the city's elite. I couldn't bear to see my brother's child grow up without a father, Richard continued, looking at me with mournful eyes. And since you and my sister-in-law went into labor on the exact same day, I made a choice. I had no other option. Right on cue, his widowed sister-in-law Monica rushed forward. Tears spilled over her perfectly contoured cheeks as she grabbed my hands, apologizing frantically, swearing up and down she had absolutely no idea her child had been swapped with mine. My mother-in-law, Helen, immediately stepped in to play the peacemaker, feigning utter shock before pivoting to cold, hard pragmatism. Well, Coral, since your biological son is mentally incapacitated and cannot inherit the company, giving the empire to your nephew still keeps the wealth within the family. It's a blessing in disguise. I just stood there, silent, unmoving. Taking my silence as submission, Richard turned to my son and his new wife, demanding they call Monica Mom. Your biological mother has suffered so much for you, Richard urged, his voice thick with guilt-tripping authority. She endured the agony of being separated from her flesh and blood because of my actions. You owe her. As for the woman who raised you, she will take her disabled son and live a quiet life. She'll be fine. Anyone with a pulse could see this for what it was, a meticulously orchestrated coup. But as the victim of this grand conspiracy, I wasn't angry, not in the slightest. Instead, I smiled, reached out, and gently helped Richard to his feet. Isn't that a coincidence, Richard? I murmured, my voice carrying effortlessly over the dead-silent room. You spent so much time crying over your brother's fatherless baby back then, that I decided to swap the infants, too. Just moments before, Thomas and his wife, Jessica, had raised their champagne flutes. Surrounded by our closest friends, board members and industry titans, my son had publicly thanked me. Thank you for your relentless guidance, Mom, Thomas had said, his eyes shining. Jessica and I promised to take Morton Corp to new heights. I had been holding back tears, nodding with overwhelming pride. That was when Richard sighed heavily, stepping in to shatter the moment. Thomas, he said, his tone thick with condescension. The person you should really be thanking is your Aunt Monica. If it weren't for her, you would never have had the chance to sit in the CEO's chair. The room flatlined. Everyone knew Thomas was the heir to the Morton empire simply because he was my son, Coral Morton's son. What on earth did my husband's tragic, clinging sister-in-law have to do with it? Before the crowd could process the absurdity, Richard dropped to his knees in front of my custom gown. Coral, I'm so sorry. He looked up, a picture of tortured nobility. Thomas isn't our son. He belongs to my brother and Monica. The impact of the words hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back 2 steps, the breath knocked from my lungs. Jessica caught my arm instantly, guiding me into a velvet chair. She and Thomas flanked me like bodyguards, radiating a fierce, protective energy that steadied my racing heart. Thomas's jaw was clenched tight. He glared down at his father. What the hell are you talking about, Dad? Richard had clearly anticipated the resistance. He waved it off, keeping his sorrowful gaze fixed on me. You both gave birth on the same day in the same hospital, Richard explained, his voice projecting for the audience. My heart broke knowing Thomas would grow up without his father. So, I switched the bassinets in the nursery. He paused, letting the tragedy marinate. But now, Jessica is pregnant. You're starting your own family. I have to confess. My brother's only child already took your last name, Coral. I cannot allow my brother's grandchild to carry the Morton name as well. If I let that happen, how could I ever face my brother in the afterlife? To ensure his narrative stuck, Richard motioned to the AV team. The massive screens, previously showing the Morton Corp logo, flickered to display a grainy, decades-old security video from the maternity ward, supposedly proving he had swapped the newborns. The ballroom erupted. Whispers turned to harsh murmurs. For 25 years, society had viewed Richard as the fortunate man who married into the Morton dynasty, a man who swallowed his pride for a corner office. Now the room was convinced this trophy husband had spent 2 decades playing a long, venomous game of chess, waiting for the exact moment the inheritance was finalized. The judgment in the room was palpable. People were openly sneering at him. Seeing the tide turning against him, Monica immediately activated her performance. She gasped, a delicate hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in a flawless cocktail of shock and maternal joy. Anyone looking at her would think she was furious at Richard's rogue actions, yet profoundly overwhelmed to discover her biological son was this brilliant, handsome CEO. It was a masterpiece of a reaction. She must have rehearsed it in her vanity mirror for months. Richard, what have you done? Monica wailed, her voice trembling. You felt sorry for your nephew, yes, but to steal a child? To me, the boy I raised is my son, no matter what. But Coral, she is a businesswoman. How could a woman like her ever accept something so horrific? Helen, my mother-in-law, was practically pinching her own leg to stop herself from smiling. What's done is done, Helen announced, waving a dismissive hand. There's no point pointing fingers now. If you ask me, this is a blessing. Coral's biological child is severely disabled and cannot run a corporation. Thomas is brilliant. It's a perfect fit. And since the Mortons in our family are united by marriage anyway, the money stays in the same house. What's the difference? My parents, the formidable founders of Morton Corp., were trembling with rage. My father stepped forward and delivered a resounding backhand across Richard's face. The smack echoed like a gunshot. Do not insult our intelligence, Richard, my father hissed. Drop the martyr act. You swapped those boys to hijack the Morton empire. If this was about a guilty conscience, you would have confessed years ago. You waited specifically for the day Thomas took full legal control of the trust. You make me sick. Richard cradled his red cheek. Even now, the ingrained fear of my father's authority kept him from yelling back, but a sneer of impatience leaked into his voice. Coral, tell them to calm down. You're all misunderstanding me, Richard pleaded, playing the misunderstood saint. I just wanted to do a good thing. I planned to tell you the truth once you and Thomas bonded. But then, our biological baby was diagnosed with severe cerebral palsy. You were still recovering from a difficult labor. If I had told you your real baby was broken, you would have lost your mind. But the confession wasn't landing the way he planned. Not just with me and my parents, but with Thomas and Jessica. My son looked at the man who raised him with unadulterated disgust. This was the variable Richard hadn't accounted for. Since Thomas was a toddler, Richard had constantly fed him stories about how wonderful, brave, and tragic Aunt Monica was. He had been laying the groundwork for this very night. But he grossly underestimated my son. Frustration bled through Richard's carefully crafted facade. Thomas, you may go by Morton, but you have my family's blood in your veins. Monica's blood. Don't act like an ungrateful brat just because the Mortons have deeper pockets. Richard pointed an accusing finger. Don't forget, your biological mother and Coral are the victims here. You are the only one who profited. You control the company now. You can take care of both of your mothers. Just, in different ways. Blood is thicker than water, Thomas. As soon as the words left his mouth, Monica threw herself onto the floor at my feet. Coral, to you, Thomas was just a pawn to inherit your company, Monica sobbed, clutching at my skirt. But he is my flesh and blood. All these years, I thought my son was disabled. I bathed him, fed him, suffered through the endless agony. I took your punishment, Coral. But I forgive you. I just beg of you. Give my boy back to me. Keep your company. Thomas doesn't need it. A cold, razor-sharp smile touched my lips. Nothing happening tonight surprised me. Not a single thing. And Monica's little speech about not wanting the money? Pure garbage. She wasn't stupid. Changing the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate isn't like swapping out a dining chair. Thomas had spent years building his loyalties within the board. I couldn't just fire him with a snap of my fingers, even if I wanted to. Attempting to sever Thomas from Morton Corp would tank the stock and incite a shareholder revolt. Furthermore, if I brought my disabled biological son into the spotlight, the world would know the Morton dynasty had no viable successor. At my age, having another child was a medical impossibility. The wolves on Wall Street would smell blood in the water. Rivals would initiate hostile takeovers before the week was out. Richard and Monica knew this. They knew my only logical move to save my family's legacy would be to swallow the bitter pill, accept Thomas as the heir, and beg him to have children who would carry the Morton name. Either way, they would have me by the throat. But I didn't address them. I simply turned my head and looked at the young man standing beside me. Thomas, I said softly, what do you make of all this? Thomas had reached his breaking point. I had raised him to be a shark in the boardroom, not a fool. He saw the exact same extortion play I did. They timed this perfectly. And in Thomas's eyes, I was his mother. The only one that mattered. His voice was like ice. I don't believe a word of this. He glared at Richard. You're trying to extort my mother and hijack her company. It all makes sense now. I always thought it was sick how you acted. Mom suggested years ago that Monica should remarry, and you fought tooth and nail to keep her in our guest house. Thomas stepped in front of me, shielding me. And for the record, Mom has loved me unconditionally since my first breath. Even if she knew about the swap, it just means she wanted to protect me from your toxic, plotting family. You sicken me. Thomas's words ripped the elegant mask right off their faces. Monica scrambled up, shaking her head frantically. No, baby. I was only kind to you because I thought my own son was broken, and seeing a healthy boy like you. It was like looking at what I lost. It was just a mother's intuition drawing me to you. It was a lie so vile it made my stomach turn, especially because I knew the truth. After my traumatic delivery, I had been bedridden for weeks. But once I recovered, my mother had sat me down and told me what really happened to the other baby. You and Monica delivered on the same day, my mother had said, her voice tight with disapproval. We paid for her to have the VIP suite, and the same elite neonatal nurses you had. But Monica and Helen chased the medical staff out. They refused to trust the doctors. There was a heat wave, my mother had continued, her eyes dark. The baby spiked a massive fever. Instead of calling the nurses, they refused to turn on the AC and wrapped him in thick blankets, claiming some old wives' tale about sweating out the toxins. By the time our security forced the door open and got the doctors, the baby's brain was practically boiling. The damage was permanent. Looking back at them now, the puzzle pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. It wasn't ignorance. It was intentional. They tried to render my child brain dead, so I would have no choice but to rely entirely on theirs. Helen, oblivious to the fact that I knew their dark secret, rushed over to stroke Thomas's arm. Your real mother is a gentle soul, Thomas, Helen cooed. Not like Coral. Coral only cares about profit margins. Your mother would love you rich or poor. Don't side with the Mortons just because they can buy you nicer things. She shot me a venomous look. Coral might be a victim, but she's hoarded another woman's son for decades. Any pity I had for her is gone. We don't want the Morton money, Thomas, but if they give it to you, it's merely compensation for what she stole from us. The ballroom devolved into absolute chaos. Security was scrambling. My father was clutching his chest. Not a single dime of Morton money will ever go to parasites like you. I'd burn it to the ground first. Fear spiked in my chest. My parents were healthy, but they were older. I urgently signaled my assistant to bring the concierge doctor over to them. Jessica and Thomas tried to move toward my parents, but Monica and Helen physically blocked them, clawing at Thomas's tuxedo jacket. Look, Monica cried hysterically. The Mortons don't even care about you. You control the company now, Thomas. Change your last name. Give my grandchild his rightful name. Richard stood by, pretending to mediate while throwing gasoline on the fire. He looked at me with cold reproach. If you weren't such a ruthless, calculating woman, I wouldn't have feared for my nephew's life, Richard said, loud enough for the press to hear. The fact that I swapped them and you didn't even notice proves you're a terrible mother. He's just an asset to you. Give him back to the woman who actually loves him. Over the din of shouting, Thomas finally roared. Enough. The room jolted into silence. I don't care about your sob stories, Thomas snarled, his chest heaving. This is a hostile takeover disguised as a family tragedy. If you're telling the truth, and I'm not a Morton, then fine. I resign. I'll hand the keys to a trustee until Mom's real son can be cared for. I won't take a single red cent of this company. A profound warmth bloomed in my chest. 25 years of sleepless nights, of fiercely protecting and educating this boy. It was worth every second. My son was a king. My parents let out a collective breath. Thomas was a man of his word. The legacy was safe from vultures. But the sheer heartbreak of the situation still hung heavy in the air. The boy we loved with every fiber of our beings was supposedly a stranger's blood. While my heart found peace, Richard and his cabal completely panicked. The facade shattered. Richard lunged forward, grabbing Thomas by the lapels. His voice dropped to a vicious, guttural whisper meant only for us. Listen to me, you little fool, Richard hissed. Your disabled cousin is chemically castrated from the medications. He will never have kids. You either keep the Morton name, take the CEO spot, and make sure your child inherits it all, or you watch the Morton legacy die today. Monica leaned in, her eyes manic. If you don't publicly acknowledge me as your mother right now, we go to the press tomorrow. We'll tell the world you've known for years. We'll say you stayed with Coral out of pure greed. We will destroy your reputation, Thomas. We have nothing to lose. Thomas was so angry his hands shook, speechless at the sheer depravity of his own blood. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my gown. The quiet moment had passed. It was time. Richard. Monica, I said, my voice calm, cutting through their hysteria like a scalpel. That's quite a compelling threat. But I'm afraid I have to decline. Because. Before I could finish, Monica threw herself onto the marble floor again, sobbing violently. I don't care about the last name anymore, she wailed, pivoting her strategy. Just let Jessica's baby carry our blood. We can all live together. We won't bother you, Coral. We just want to be a family. Richard dropped back to his knees beside her, his head bowed. Coral, think about it, he muttered darkly. We either rise together, or we burn this whole empire to the ground. I stepped forward. Slowly, delicately, I reached out and pulled them both to their feet. Will you two at least give me the floor for a moment? I asked pleasantly. I've been trying to tell you. Things are a bit more complicated than your little narrative. I looked Richard dead in the eye. Years ago, when your brother died, Monica was threatening to get an abortion. You spent hours, sometimes entire days, locked in her bedroom, comforting her. I was willing to adopt the child, but I didn't want to upset my parents. So lying in that hospital bed, I did something foolish. I smiled. A real, genuine smile. When the nurses took the babies to the nursery on the second night, I sneaked in, and I swapped them back. The silence that followed was not the quiet of polite society, it was the suffocating vacuum of an impending explosion. Richard stared at me, his mouth slack, his tailored collar suddenly choking him. The predatory triumph in his eyes bled away, replaced by an ugly, frantic confusion. He blinked once, twice, his mind desperately running the arithmetic of a game he had spent a quarter of a century calculating. You what? Richard whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. Beside him, Monica froze halfway between a sob and a gasp. Her theatrical tears ceased instantly. Her manicured fingers remained hooked into the fabric of my skirt, but the strength had abandoned them. I swapped them back, I repeated, enunciating each syllable with icy precision. On the second night, while you were in Monica's hospital suite discussing the tragedy of your late brother's estate, you thought you were being clever, Richard. You slipped past the maternity ward nurse on duty, whom you had bribed with a watch my father bought you, and switched the bassinets. I took half a step backward, stepping cleanly out of Monica's grasp. You believed you had left me with Monica's boy, while handing my flesh and blood over to her. But I noticed the birthmark behind my son's left ear the second the doctor laid him on my chest after delivery. A small crimson crescent. When I woke from the anesthesia the next morning and looked into the crib beside my bed, that mark was gone. A low murmur rippled through the front row of the audience. Jessica's eyes widened, her grip on Thomas's arm tightening not in anxiety, but in fierce, surging vindication. I knew your character, Richard, I continued smoothly, gesturing to the sommelier at the edge of the dais, who immediately brought me a fresh glass of sparkling water. I knew that a man who spent his 20s living off my family's goodwill, while resenting the very hand that fed him, would eventually look for leverage. You wanted an heir tied irrevocably to your own petty bloodline, independent of my father's strict trusts. So I took my son back. That's impossible. Monica shrieked, scrambling to her feet, abandoning every shred of her delicate, aggrieved widow persona. Her voice tore through the hall, grating and harsh. You're lying. You're making it up to save face. Thomas is my son. He's my baby. Is he, Monica? I tilted my head, looking at her with genuine, freezing pity. If Thomas was your baby, then whose child did you wrap in wool blankets in the middle of a July heat wave? Whose brain did you allow to cook at 105 degrees while you barred the pediatricians from the room? The air was sucked out of Monica's lungs. The blood drained from her face so rapidly that her heavy foundation looked like white chalk on a corpse. Behind her, Helen let out a sound like a wounded animal. No. Helen stammered, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string threatened to snap. No, Richard. Richard, tell her she's lying. We did that. To her child. We sacrificed her brat so you could control the Morton board. We didn't. We wouldn't. The realization hit them simultaneously, a devastating, cosmic irony that buckled their knees. If I had swapped the infants back on the second night, then the child Monica and Helen had neglected, the child whose future they had intentionally destroyed to ensure Coral Morton would be left with a broken heir, was Monica's own biological son. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis, packed with the city's political elite, high court judges and Fortune 500 executives, turned into an amphitheater of utter ruin. Richard lunged forward, his composure entirely shattered. You're bluffing. You're a cold-blooded sociopath, Coral. You're just trying to drive a wedge between us. Show us the proof. You don't have proof. I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my voice. I merely raised 2 fingers and snapped them. From the double oak doors at the back of the hall, Marcus Vance, the chief legal counsel for Morton Corp., stepped through the aisle, flanked by 4 uniformed officers from the State Police Financial and Major Crimes Divisions. Marcus carried a sleek leather portfolio. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea. I have spent 25 years preparing for tonight, Richard, I said softly, my voice projecting through the wireless lapel mic pinned to my gown. Do you truly believe a woman who built the international logistics division of this conglomerate from the ground up would leave her son's legitimacy to a battle of memories? Marcus approached the stage, handing me a sealed manila envelope. I broke the wax seal, sliding out the contents. 3 independent certified genetic panels, I said, holding up the documents, so the front row cameras of the press pool could catch the high-resolution notary stamps, conducted 48 hours ago by 3 distinct ISO-accredited laboratories. Thomas underwent routine executive health screenings last week for our corporate life insurance policy. We cross-referenced his DNA against my personal profile on file with the Morton Medical Trust. I looked down at the paper, then directly into Richard's bulging eyes. Probability of maternal relation between Coral Morton and Thomas Morton. 99.99%. Thomas is my biological son. He carries the blood of the Morton founders. He is the rightful, undisputed heir to every brick, patent, and dollar of this empire. A collective roar of murmurs and camera shutters exploded across the room. Flashbulbs strobed against the golden walls like lightning. Now, I continued, pulling a second sheet from the folder, let us discuss the second test. Richard's knees began to shake visibly. Coral, please. Stop. Let's take this to a private room. We're family. You forfeited the right to privacy the moment you hired an AV crew to humiliate my father on his own stage. I cut him off, my voice dropping an octave into pure, unyielding steel. 2 weeks ago, my private security team visited the private care facility in Zurich, the one funded entirely by Morton Corp Foundations, where you stashed the boy you named Julian, the boy you told everyone was my broken son. I looked at Monica, whose mouth was opening and closing soundlessly, her chest heaving in shallow, hyperventilating gasps. We took a cheek swab from Julian, I said, and we tested it against the DNA samples collected from your vanity table, Monica, and from you, Richard. I paused, letting the entire room lean in. Julian is not my son. He is Monica's biological child. And what makes this truly poetic, Richard, is that Julian is not your late brother's son either. I turned the paper toward them. Probability of paternal relation between Richard and Julian, 99.98%. You fathered that child during your secret affair with your brother's wife while my father was funding your brother's cancer treatments in Boston. You two produced that baby together. And then in your greedy sick scramble to steal my family's legacy, you cooked your own son's mind in a locked hospital room. The scream that tore from Monica's throat was inhuman. It was a jagged, piercing wail of a mother realizing she had been the architect of her own child's living damnation. She dropped to the floor, her fingernails scraping desperately against the polished marble, clawing at her own hair. No. No, no, no. God, no. Richard, you told me it was her baby. You swore you moved the bassinets. I did. Richard screamed back, turning on her with wild, feral eyes entirely uncaring of the hundreds of witnesses filming his every word. I moved them. I swear to God I moved them. And I moved them back, you idiot, I said, looking down at him from the dais, like an empress looking at an insect. Because unlike you, Richard, I pay attention to details. You didn't even notice that when you swapped the babies, you left the nursery wristbands on the wrong infants. I had the head of pediatrics, a woman who went to boarding school with my mother, quietly verify the blood types before the sunrise. Helen, meanwhile, seemed to age 20 years in 20 seconds. Her aristocratic posture collapsed, her back hunching as she looked from Richard to Monica, the realization settling into her brittle bones. My grandson, Helen whimpered, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The only boy carrying my late husband's lineage. We ruined him. You didn't just ruin him, Helen, I said, stepping toward the microphone again. You committed aggravated assault and intentional child endangerment against an infant. The medical records from that night, along with the sworn affidavits from the 2 nurses you physically barred from the room, were never destroyed. My father had the hospital board seal them in a secure vault. My father, who had by now recovered his composure, stepped up beside me. His hand was steady, resting squarely on Thomas's shoulder. His gaze upon Richard was absolute zero. For 25 years, my father rumbled, his deep baritone carrying the full weight of the Morton name. We allowed you to believe your little scheme had succeeded. Do you know why, Richard? Richard looked up, his face slick with sweat, his eyes hollowed out by terror. Because, my father continued, we needed Thomas to grow up without looking over his shoulder. If we had exposed you when he was an infant, you would have spent 2 decades filing frivolous custody suits, dragging our family name through the tabloids, and poisoning the boy's childhood with your toxic presence. We waited until Thomas was a grown man, a man with a sharp mind, an iron will, and full legal independence. Thomas stepped forward. He looked down at the man who had pretended to be his noble father, and the woman who had tried to claim him as a prize. There was no rage in my son's face. There was only a profound, crystalline contempt. You called me an asset earlier, Richard, Thomas said, his voice ringing clear and authoritative through the ballroom. You thought my loyalty could be bought by playing on my guilt. But the truth is, even if my mother hadn't swapped the cribs, even if I had been Monica's biological son by some cosmic tragedy, I would have chosen Coral Morton 10,000 times over. Thomas reached out, taking Jessica's hand in his, and then resting his other hand over mine. A mother isn't the person whose womb you occupied, Thomas declared. A mother is the woman who sat by my bed during every childhood illness, who taught me how to read balance sheets, who taught me how to treat my wife with respect, and who showed me what integrity looks like. You gave me nothing but a surname I will gladly strip from your branch of the family tree. Officers. Marcus Vance's voice cut through the aftermath like a guillotine blade. You may execute the warrants. The 4 state police officers advanced onto the stage. The click of metal handcuffs sounded unnaturally loud through the sound system. Richard, the lead investigator said, reading from a laminated card. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, interstate wire fraud, and grand larceny involving the unauthorized transfer of Morton Trust assets into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands over the last 16 years. Wait, what? Richard gasped as the officer wrenched his arms behind his back. What assets? I never touched the core trusts. You didn't touch the core trusts because you couldn't, I said coldly. Every account you thought was an offshore shell company was actually a forensic honeypot set up by our internal auditors. Every dollar you skimmed from the Morton Logistics supply chain to fund Monica's lavish lifestyle, every luxury car you bought for Helen under fake vendor names, it was all tracked, cataloged, and signed for by your personal digital signature. Monica, the second officer stated, hauling the sobbing woman up by her elbows. You are being taken into custody under an active warrant for criminal child neglect resulting in permanent bodily harm, and conspiracy to commit extortion. Helen, the third officer added, guiding the dazed, trembling old woman toward the side exit. You are being named as an unindicted co-conspirator pending grand jury review. As the police marched the 3 of them down the center aisle of the ballroom, under the blinding glare of 100 smartphone cameras and live television broadcasts, Richard turned his head back, his face contorted in a desperate, pathetic plea. Coral, think of our marriage. 25 years. You can't do this to me. I'm your husband. I picked up my champagne flute from the table, turning my back on him. Completely. My lawyers filed the divorce petition at 4 o'clock this afternoon, Richard. I said, not even looking over my shoulder. Under the terms of our prenuptial agreement, any act of infidelity or criminal conspiracy against the Morton family completely nullifies your claims to alimony, property, or corporate stock. You leave this room with precisely what you brought into it. The suit on your back and a mountain of debt. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut behind them, cutting off Richard's frantic screams. The room remained utterly silent for 3 seconds. Then my father raised his glass. Ladies and gentlemen, the old man announced, his voice steady, commanding, and filled with unbroken pride. The drama is concluded. Let us raise a toast to the true, unbroken succession of this company, to my daughter Coral, and to our CEO Thomas Morton. A thunderous ovation erupted across the room, louder than any applause the Morton Corporation had ever heard in its 70-year history. The morning sun broke over the manicured grounds of the Morton ancestral estate in Greenwich, casting long, peaceful shadows across the dewy lawns. For the first time in 25 years, the air inside the main house felt clean. I stood on the stone veranda, holding a cup of Earl Grey tea, watching the groundskeepers quietly pack the belongings from the detached guest cottage into an unmarked moving van. The cottage, where Monica had lived rent-free for decades, under the guise of the grieving widow, had been thoroughly searched by forensic accountants and private investigators at dawn. Every designer dress, every piece of jewelry purchased with embezzled corporate funds, every luxury handbag had been seized as court-ordered collateral against the tens of millions Richard had stolen from our logistics subsidiaries. Footsteps echoed softly on the stone behind me. Mom. I turned to see Thomas standing there. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, looking rested and grounded, though the faint shadows beneath his eyes betrayed the emotional exhaustion of the night before. How is Jessica? I asked gently, setting my teacup on the wrought iron table. She's sleeping. Thomas smiled softly. The doctor came by at 8 to do a routine checkup. The baby is healthy, strong, and entirely unfazed by family theatrics. Good. I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. That child is our future, Thomas. I promised myself decades ago that whatever poison Richard brought into this house, it would never reach the next generation. Thomas walked over to the balustrade, leaning his elbows against the stone, looking out over the expansive gardens. Did you really know, Mom? He asked quietly. From the very beginning? I walked over, standing beside him, resting my hand over his. I knew Richard was weak, I said truthfully. When my father agreed to our marriage, it was because Richard seemed malleable, quiet, and content to play the role of a supportive partner. But weakness in a man is dangerous, Thomas. A weak man who feels overshadowed doesn't seek to grow, he seeks to tear down everything around him so he can feel tall. I looked out at the rolling hills. When your grandfather told me about the fever incident with Julian, when the medical staff confirmed that Helen and Monica had intentionally kept the doors locked to sabotage the baby they thought was mine, my heart broke. Not for Richard, but for the cruelty human beings are capable of when driven by greed. Why did you keep Julian in Zurich all these years? Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. You paid for his care. You ensured he had the best neurological therapists in the world, even though you knew he wasn't yours. Because he was an innocent child, I said softly, looking into my son's eyes. Julian didn't ask to be born into Richard and Monica's sordid little conspiracy. He was a victim of their malice. Just because his biological parents were monsters didn't mean I had to become one too. I couldn't bring him into our home without triggering the confrontation before you were ready, but I could ensure he was warm, safe, and protected from the woman who burned his brain. Thomas wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a fierce, protective embrace. Thank you, he whispered against my hair. For fighting for me. For protecting me before I even knew what the world was. Always, my son, I whispered back, tears finally stinging my eyes. A mother's first duty is to be the shield. 3 months later, the state Supreme Court convened for the trial that had dominated global headlines. The media called it the cradle coup. Every major news network had anchors stationed outside the courthouse, broadcasting daily updates on the collapse of Richard Morton's inner circle. I sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Thomas, Jessica, and our senior legal team. Across the aisle, seated at the defense table, Richard looked like a hollowed-out ghost of the man who had preened in front of the ballroom mirror. He had lost 30 pounds. His expensive custom suits hung off his gaunt frame like rags. His hair, once meticulously dyed and styled, was streaked with gray. Beside him, Monica sat in standard state-issued beige prison attire, her head bowed, staring blankly at the polished wooden table. Since the night of the gala, when she learned she had permanently crippled her own child, her mental state had rapidly deteriorated. Her high-powered defense attorneys had attempted to plead temporary insanity, but the mountain of premeditated journals, secret bank records, and recorded conversations Marcus Vance submitted to the grand jury shredded that defense to ribbons. Helen sat behind them in a wheelchair, her social status completely vaporized, her former country club peers having shunned her so thoroughly that even her distant cousins had changed their phone numbers. In the matter of the state versus Richard Douglas, the judge's voice cut through the tense courtroom like a gavel stroke. On counts 1 through 14, conspiracy to commit grand larceny, securities fraud, and aggravated embezzlement, the court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. Richard didn't even flinch. He simply closed his eyes, a single tear cutting through the dust on his cheek. On the matter of state versus Monica Douglas, the judge continued, looking down at the broken woman with unmasked severity. On counts of criminal child endangerment resulting in permanent catastrophic disability, and attempted extortion, the court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. The judge adjusted his spectacles, looking out over the courtroom. The calculated cruelty displayed in this case, the willingness to sacrifice the physical and mental well-being of an innocent newborn for financial leverage against an estate, is among the most reprehensible acts this bench has ever witnessed. Greed is a common vice in this city, but the cold-blooded destruction of a child's mind is a depravity that demands the absolute maximum penalty under the law. The sentence was swift and merciless. Richard Douglas was sentenced to 22 years at the Sullivan Correctional Facility, with no possibility of parole for the first 15. Monica Douglas received 18 years at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, along with a permanent restraining order forbidding her from ever contacting Julian, Thomas, or any member of the Morton family. Helen Douglas was ordered to pay $3 million in restitution and was placed under 5 years of strict house arrest, stripped of every asset her son had illegally funneled into her name. As the bailiff stepped forward to escort Richard and Monica through the holding doors, Richard looked back across the aisle one last time. His eyes found mine. There was no anger left in him. There was only the bottomless, terrifying realization that his entire life, every lie, every scheme, every compromise of his soul, had led him to an 8x10 concrete box, while the empire he tried to steal flourished without him. I didn't sneer. I didn't gloat. I simply held his gaze, calm and unshakable, until the iron door clicked shut behind him, severing his existence from our lives forever. 1 year later, the Morton Corporation's annual shareholder gala was held not in a rented ballroom, but in the newly inaugurated Coral Morton Research Center for Pediatric Neurology, a $50 million state-of-the-art facility funded entirely by the recovered assets seized from Richard's offshore accounts. The grand atrium was bathed in warm, natural light pouring through 3-story Glass arches. Outside, the autumn leaves of New York glowed in vibrant shades of gold and crimson. I stood by the grand staircase, wearing an emerald green gown, holding a glass of vintage champagne. Beside me, Jessica was laughing, holding their 3-month-old daughter, little Eleanor Coral Morton. The baby was sleeping peacefully, wrapped in a hand-knitted cashmere blanket, her tiny hand gripping her mother's finger. Thomas stood at the podium in the center of the atrium, addressing a crowd of 2,000 executives, scientists, board members, and international partners. Under our new leadership, Thomas's voice echoed through the hall, rich with authority, confidence, and warmth. Morton Corp has achieved record quarterly growth. But more importantly, we have redirected our focus toward what truly matters, building something that outlasts us, built on the foundations of integrity, accountability, and genuine family. He paused, looking across the crowded floor directly at me. His eyes shone with the same fierce, unwavering love I had seen on the day he took his first steps. My mother taught me that a true legacy isn't something you inherit through trickery or entitlement, Thomas said, his voice softening with deep emotion. It is something you earn through sacrifice, through loyalty, and through the courage to stand for the truth, no matter how heavy the cost. Thomas raised his glass toward me. To Coral Morton, the matriarch of our family, the architect of our future, and the finest mother a man could ever have. The entire room rose to their feet in a standing ovation. I raised my glass in return, a soft, radiant smile gracing my face. As the applause washed over the hall, I looked down at little Eleanor in Jessica's arms, and then up at my son standing tall on the stage. The weeds had been pulled. The parasites had been eradicated. The Morton empire was clean, the bloodline was pure, and the throne was finally indisputably secure.